What's the difference between a Zen core, a CUDA core, and a Tensor core? Not vaguely what's the difference, like one's for graphics and one's for AI, but specifically what are the different mechanisms we're actually talking about in silicon when we talk about these different core types. What I wanted to do in this video series is give everyone a really good understanding of precisely what we're talking about, such that they can understand how these things work, where they fit into CPU and GPU pipelines, and most importantly, how to think about the differences between them and why we get different results when we do things on CPUs versus GPUs in terms of performance. Here in part one, what I'd like to do is start with the most concrete thing we can. I'd like to put aside all the abstract stuff like flowcharts and the operational ideas of what these things do, and instead just ground our understanding in the physical silicon itself. Like, what do these cores look like? Can we see them if we look at the chip? And to do that, what I want to start with is just to take a CPU on the left and a GPU on the right, and then zoom in to see if we can actually locate the things that we're calling cores. For the CPU, we'll use an AMD Ryzen 5 7600, and for the GPU, we'll use an NVIDIA RTX 4090. Now, these are in no way comparable chips in terms of die area or cost. I picked them because they contain cores that were popular at the time of this recording, and they both have publicly available high-quality die shots, so we can look at them in detail. Thankfully, as we'll see, it doesn't really matter that much which specific chips we look at. Once we understand what the different types of cores are and what they do, we can apply our knowledge to any CPU or GPU whose layout we know. So for now, on the left side, we're looking for a Zen 4 core, and on the right side, we're looking for an Ada Lovelace CUDA core and Tensor core. According to their spec sheets, the 7600 should have 6 Zen 4 cores, and the RTX 4090 should have 16,384 CUDA cores and 512 Tensor cores. Let's see if we can find them. If we remove the cooler and the integrated heat spreader from the chips, this is what they look like. On the GPU side, there's just one big chip labeled 8102, but on the CPU side, it's not so simple. There are two separate chips on the 7600 module. The top chip is actually the I/O die and doesn't contain any Zen 4 cores at all. To find a Zen 4 core, we need to look at the bottom chip, which is called the Core Complex Die, or CCD. Now, as we zoom in on these chips, it's important to remember that the scale is very different. The Zen 4 CCD is only 70 square millimeters total. This is much smaller than the monolithic NVIDIA chip that's over 600 square millimeters. The NVIDIA chip is almost 9 times larger. Please keep that in mind as we look at these chips in detail. Although it may not appear so at first, although they differ greatly in size, the high-level layout of these two chips is actually very similar. If we start on the CPU side, we can split the chip into 3 distinct sections. There are parts on the left and right that appear to be mirrors of each other, and then there's a band running down the middle. On the GPU side, we see something similar, but laid out vertically rather than horizontally. The top and the bottom part mirror each other rather than the left and the right. If we rotate the GPU 90 degrees like this, we can line up their layouts more directly. On both chips, the middle section doesn't contain the cores we're looking for. It's occupied by shared resources such as the last level cache or LLC. To find our cores, we have to look at the bands on either side. And since they are mirrors of each other, we can simplify things by just focusing on the left band. If we zoom in, we see that the CPU and GPU have a similar layout once again. From top to bottom, both are made up of what appear to be repeating tiles. On the CPU side, there are 4, and on the GPU side, it's 6. If the only type of core we were looking for was the Zen 4 core, we could now congratulate ourselves because we have found one. Each of the tiles on the CPU side is actually a Zen 4 core complete with its dedicated L2 cache. On the GPU side, however, we're far from done. NVIDIA doesn't call these tiles cores at all. It calls them graphics processing clusters, or GPCs. Measuring the size of the Zen 4 core and the Ada GPC, we can see that the GPC is much larger, nearly 7 times larger, in fact. And as you might guess from the term cluster, if we look closely, we can see that the GPC itself is also made up of repeating tiles. Although there is a section on the right which contains several non-repeating things like the raster engine, we can see that the rest of the GPC is made up of what appear to be 3 more repeating tiles. However, if we zoom in on one of the tiles, we see that actually the tiles themselves each appear to be made up of 2 mirrored subtiles, one on the top and one on the bottom. So in fact, there are 6 subtiles in a GPC. If we measure the size of one of these subtiles, we actually find that it matches the area of a Zen 4 core pretty closely. Both are around 3.8 square millimeters. So are these CUDA and Tensor cores? Still no, NVIDIA calls these texture processing clusters, or TPCs. TPCs are trickier to divide further because NVIDIA doesn't tell us much about how these chips are actually laid out. We can guess that the top and bottom are tiled due to how closely they mirror each other, but the middle is trickier. Luckily for us, the general consensus on the layout of Ada GPUs is that the middle section doesn't contain CUDA or Tensor cores. It's believed to hold things like ray tracing cores and texture units, which aren't what we're looking for. So we can zoom in on the part of a single TPC that we care about and ignore the middle section we can't discern. When we do that, we see, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, there's yet more mirroring going on. Although they're not quite identical, you can see that this part of the TPC is made up of left and right mirrored tiles. That's because, just like before, NVIDIA splits TPCs into two subtiles called streaming multiprocessors, or SMs. Technically, when NVIDIA says SM, they also include its portion of the middle area of the TPC that we weren't sure how to subdivide. But thankfully, since we're only looking for CUDA and Tensor cores here, we can safely ignore that part and zoom in further. If we measure the part of the SM we're looking at now, we finally arrived at a section of the NVIDIA chip that's smaller than a Zen 4 core. A Zen 4 core is about 3 times larger than this part of the streaming multiprocessor we're looking at. But even so, we're still not at the level of a CUDA or Tensor core. Based on technical details NVIDIA publishes, we can infer that this section of the streaming multiprocessor probably contains many things in addition to CUDA and Tensor cores. Things like L1 caches, schedulers, register files, load store units, and special function units. Unfortunately, at this point, we've run out of die-shot resolution to go further. We can see some vague boundaries, but without more detail, it is impossible to really be sure where the CUDA and Tensor cores are. We can guess with reasonable certainty that the brighter structures are storage-related. These areas likely contain things like the L1 caches and register files, but beyond that, all we can really make out are a few faint boundaries. Now, in theory, if we had money to burn, we could pay a lab to capture a higher resolution die shot. Or even better, we could pay them to capture photon emission microscopy videos of the 4090 while it ran some benchmarks we carefully constructed to use specific parts of the chip. That would give us a much better picture of where things are. And hey, if there's any lab out there that wants to do a collaboration video with me on that, definitely don't hesitate to contact us. But assuming no one takes us up on that offer, and since we don't have money to burn, we are left to guesstimate from here. If we measure the silicon area that appears to consist of storage elements, we find it's around 30%. That leaves 70% of this area to contain everything else: schedulers, load store units, special function units, CUDA cores, Tensor cores, and so on. Fortunately, NVIDIA does tell us how many of each main element there are. In this area of the chip, we expect to find 16 load store units, 4 special function units, 128 CUDA cores, and 4 Tensor cores. Unfortunately, NVIDIA doesn't give us any information about their relative sizes. So to make any estimates, we would need to somewhat blindly guess 2 percentages. First, we'd need to guess what percentage of the remaining area is taken up by CUDA and Tensor cores as opposed to everything else. Is it 30% cores? 40%? 50? 60? Then we need to guess how much of that resulting area is taken up by CUDA cores as opposed to Tensor cores. Is it 40%, 60%, 50-50, 60-40? For whatever percentages we pick, we can then do the math to determine approximately how big each CUDA and Tensor core is, but without those 2 percentages, we really can't do much. Now, I should also mention that technically, according to NVIDIA, the 128 CUDA cores are actually separated into 2 types. 64 of them are floating point only CUDA cores, and 64 of them are combined floating point and integer CUDA cores. So if we actually had high enough resolution to see details like that, we might also be able to compute 2 different sizes for CUDA cores themselves. But as we've already seen, we're nowhere near the die-shot resolution we'd need for that kind of analysis. So for our low level of accuracy here, it's sufficient to assume a single average CUDA core size. So let's pick some reasonable percentages and do the math. Suppose we say a large amount of the remaining area is cores, 60%, and that 70% of that is CUDA cores and 30% is Tensor cores. That would give us a CUDA core size of around 0.003 square millimeters and a Tensor core size of around 0.04 square millimeters. Since we know the size of a Zen 4 core, we can also superimpose how big these 2 GPU core types would be if they appeared on a Zen 4 CCD. This is roughly how big each core type would be. Now, of course, we really don't have any way to guess these percentages accurately. We could kick it up to 80% cores or down to 50% cores, and we have no idea which one is closer. We could also say more space went to CUDA cores or more space went to Tensor cores than our original ratio. We can play around all day with these percentages, but without better data, we can't really get more accurate. We can, however, compute an upper bound, since the entire area that could contain cores is around 0.88 square millimeters. If it was entirely devoted to the 128 CUDA cores, which of course is impossible, but if it was, each CUDA core would be around 0.007 square millimeters. If, on the other hand, it was entirely devoted to the 4 Tensor cores, which of course is also impossible, each Tensor core would be around 0.22 square millimeters. Those are the upper bounds on CUDA and Tensor core sizes. We know they each have to be smaller than that, significantly smaller. Given that, although we couldn't measure an exact size like we could for the Zen 4 core, we can easily conclude that Tensor cores are quite small compared to a Zen 4 core, and CUDA cores are likely smaller still. Even without knowing what these cores actually do, we now have some intuition about their relative complexity. When people say Zen 4 core, they're talking about something way more complicated than what they're talking about when they say CUDA or Tensor core. As we'll see once we understand more about what these different core types actually do, this seemingly strange result actually makes perfect sense. But we'll have to wait for later parts of the series to see why. For now, it's time to wrap up our physical core search by checking how many of each core type we think we found on these chips. To do that, let's zoom back out just like we zoomed in. As we do, we'll count the total number of cores we see. Starting here on the GPU side, we know that each of these streaming multiprocessors has 128 CUDA cores and 4 Tensor cores. If we zoom out to the TPC level, we know we have 2 SMs per TPC, for a total of 256 CUDA cores and 8 Tensor cores per texture processing cluster. Zooming out to the GPC level, we've got 6 of these texture processing clusters, for a total of 1,536 CUDA cores and 48 Tensor cores per graphics processing cluster. And we're now up to the highest level tiling on the chip, which is all the Zen core complex die actually had in the first place. So it's just 1 Zen 4 core per tile on the CPU side. If we conclude by zooming out to the entire chip on both sides, we see that the CPU has 8 tiles and the GPU has 12. This gives us a grand total of 8 Zen 4 cores on the CPU, 18,432 CUDA cores, and 576 Tensor cores on the GPU. Now, if you remember the spec sheet numbers from the beginning of this video, you might think we've done something horribly wrong. The spec sheet said there would be 6 Zen 4 cores, but we counted 8. It said there would be 16,384 CUDA cores, but we counted 18,432. It said there would only be 512 Tensor cores, but we counted 576. We are over by 2 Zen 4 cores on the CPU side, 2,048 CUDA cores, and 64 Tensor cores on the GPU side. What did we do wrong? Believe it or not, we actually didn't do anything wrong. This is all by design. One of the ways CPU and GPU vendors increase the yields they get from manufacturing is by designing chips that will still work even if there are some microscopic defects. It's a common practice to produce chips with more cores physically present than are enabled. Chips aren't fabricated individually. They are produced in bulk on giant circular silicon wafers measuring 300 millimeters in diameter. The number of chips that fit on one wafer is directly proportional to the chip's dimensions. A smaller chip, like the 70mm squared Ryzen CCD, can be tiled over 800 times on a wafer. By contrast, the massive 616 square millimeter chip in the 4090 can only fit a little over 80 times. The fabrication process is extremely delicate, and even minor microscopic variations can reduce the quality of the resulting chip. Despite everyone's best efforts, the quality of the resulting silicon varies somewhat randomly across the wafer, and a small number of unfixable defects per wafer are also inevitable. When the wafer is later cut into individual chips, even though they were meant to be identical, each chip will have differing characteristics. To avoid wasting silicon, IHVs may therefore take the resulting chips and do what's called binning. Binning is the process of testing individual chips from a wafer to determine how defect-free and performant they are. Chips with few defects that tolerate high operating frequencies are packaged and sold at higher price points as premium SKUs, while chips with more defects or lower operating frequencies are packaged and sold at lower price points. Given all this, we can easily see why AMD and NVIDIA chips might have more physical cores on them than their spec sheets warrant. In AMD's case, their strategy with Ryzen core complex dies is to put 8 physical cores on the die, then bin them based on how many of those cores perform up to spec. If all 8 of the cores functioned properly at spec, the chip could go in a Ryzen 7 7700, which claims 8 CPU cores. If on the other hand there's a defect, AMD can try selectively disabling part of the chip. Depending on how the chip is designed, they may not be able to disable just one core. AMD doesn't tell us, so we don't really know. They may have to disable cores in pairs. But whatever the internal reason, the end result is that some Zen 4 CCDs only have 6 out of the 8 cores enabled, and these are the CCDs that end up being sold in Ryzen 5 7600s, like the kind we just looked at. Now at this point, we might wonder, what about a Ryzen 9 7900? That has 16 cores. Does it use a different design for the CCD? Well, when we first looked at the chip without the heat spreader, the placement of the chips did look a bit unusual. If we recall the layout, we can actually see that there is room for a second CCD next to the one we looked at. There just didn't happen to be anything there on the Ryzen 5 7600 module. But that wouldn't be the case on a Ryzen 9 7900. Instead of making a larger die with 16 cores, AMD just uses 2 dies with 8 cores each. This process of connecting multiple smaller chips is often called a chiplet strategy, and it's been an important competitive advantage for AMD throughout the entire Zen product line. For the 4090, on the other hand, NVIDIA doesn't use chiplets. They also don't appear to bin by functioning core count for their consumer GPUs. NVIDIA 4090s are the only video cards in the lineup to use the 8102 die that we looked at. Other than a recently released China-specific model designed around export restrictions, all NVIDIA 4090s are spec'd to contain the same number of functioning cores, which is a substantial number of cores less than the number physically present on the 8102 die. NVIDIA does have a data center GPU line called L40, which does use 8102 dies. NVIDIA doesn't say, but it might be using 8102 dies cut from the same wafer as 4090s, which would suggest that the relatively few defect-free 8102 chips per wafer would end up on those cards. To the best of my knowledge, NVIDIA has never explained why there weren't more consumer GPU bins for the 8102 die. If I had to guess, I would say it had something to do with the very large size of the chip. It's plausible to assume that, when there are so few chips per wafer, the distribution of defects per individual chip is more uniform, and perhaps wouldn't yield enough differentiation to make consumer SKU binning worth it. So although it's purely speculation on my part, NVIDIA may have decided to pick a safe defect level they felt most chips would clear, and spec'd the 4090's functional core count accordingly. Specifically, we know that an Ada streaming multiprocessor has 128 CUDA cores and 4 Tensor cores. By that ratio, the extra 2048 CUDA cores and 64 Tensor cores might indicate that NVIDIA expects to turn off a total of 16 SMs, which would mean disabling 8 texture processing clusters. Now, if that number were 6 instead of 8, that would have made perfect sense. There are 6 TPCs in each graphics processing cluster, so if there was a defect on the chip, they just turn off the GPC containing the defect, and that's the end of it. But since the spec sheet indicates that 8 TPCs are disabled, not 6, it's unclear what NVIDIA's process is. Why do they need to disable 2 additional TPCs beyond the number that are contained in a graphics processing cluster? Another guess would be that there are many defects per chip. If they expected up to 8 defects per chip, they could be selectively turning off the 8 TPCs that contain those defects. But based on the size of an 8102 die and the expected defects per wafer of the TSMC process used to make them, 8 defects on a single 8102 die is extremely unlikely. The median defect count is almost certainly 1 or at most 2, so planning for 8 separate defects seems completely implausible. So unfortunately, yet again, unless NVIDIA wants to share some additional information with us, we really have no way of knowing what's going on here. But thankfully, regardless of NVIDIA's rationale, the end result for us is the same. Our core counts were correct. On both the AMD Core Complex die and the NVIDIA 8102 die, there actually are more physical cores than are enabled when sent to the customer as Ryzen 5 7600s and NVIDIA 4090s. The spec sheets for these products list how many enabled cores you'll get, not how many there are physically on the silicon, which is, of course, what we would want. Extra cores that are present but can't be used are useless to the customer, so it makes sense why spec sheets list enabled rather than physical core counts. That brings us to the end of part 1 of this series. As you saw, it was much easier to locate a Zen 4 core than a CUDA or Tensor core. And although part of the reason for that is that NVIDIA doesn't give us as much information as AMD does about how these cores are structured, so it's a little bit harder for us to guess, the biggest reason is just that CUDA and Tensor cores, even if we took the maximum possible size they could be, they're obviously much, much smaller than Zen 4 cores. Why is that? Well, that question actually sets us up very nicely for part 2 of this series. In part 2, we're going to look at what these cores actually do, and that will give us a much better picture of why they are so differently sized. If you'd like to be notified when that is available, you can always go to computerenhance.com, which is the home for these videos, and put in your email address. Then you will get the next video in your inbox as soon as it's ready. I also will put on there a link to a very special thanks for this video, which goes out to Fritz, who is the person who takes these high-quality die shots and puts them in the public domain. This is an incredible service that they do, and it's the only reason that we can even have die shots like this to show you at such a nice resolution. So I really wanted to include a thank you here on this video. It's a wonderful service, and I even contacted them to try and see if maybe we could send them a thank you, like send them some chips that they might want to take photos of or anything like that. And I haven't heard back, but I will include anything I do hear back if any of you out there want to support their work. I'll try to include that on computerenhance.com in a future update. That's about it. Links are in the description below. Until part 2, have fun programming, everyone, and I'll see you on the internet.